08 web series, Chapter 4, A Tour of the Cell. This particular chapter is going into what a cell looks like and all the properties of a cell. Now remember, the cell is the smallest building block we have for animals or even plants. So the way the author of this book takes care of that cell is twofold. One, you're going to have to make flashcards. So when I get to that particular picture, there are going to be flashcards that go with the parts of an animal cell and flashcards that go with parts of a plant cell. Now the author starts off pretty interesting, and here's our first slide. Our first slide is going to be this one, and the author says something interesting here. It says antibiotics that kill bacterial cells. Well, technically, an antibiotic doesn't kill the cell, doesn't really kill the bacteria. What antibiotics do is they prevent the bacteria from making certain structures that they need to survive. So some of them keep them from having food. So the bacteria can't grow any food or can't use certain foods, or they can't build a cell wall that surrounds them. So antibiotics are interesting in that they kill the cell, but they do so by preventing the normal function of the bacteria. Okay. All right, so next slide. So here's an example of a bacteria, very, very common on our skin for that matter. And again, I don't care whether you know that one or not, but this particular bacteria is on our skin and we have it already. And what the antibiotics would do is if you have an infection on your skin, the antibiotics will prevent these cells from growing. Next slide. Now, over here on this slide, we see that organisms are either single-celled, such as the prokaryotes and protists, or they are multicellular, like plants, animals, and fungi. That paragraph is important. People will ask about that. So single-celled, such as prokaryotes and protists, and multicellular, such as plants, animals, and fungus. The next thing we have is an important one. It is always on a test, and that is this term here called cell theory. Cell theory says that all living things are composed of cells, and all cells must come from previous cells. That means they don't come out of nowhere. So a cell begets another cell. Okay, that is very, very important, that one cell gives rise to another cell. So we have come from some cell long ago, and now we are here. And we are giving cells to our kids. So as we have kids, they have cells. Okay, so cells give rise to cells. How does a little baby grow into an adult? Well, it must have cell division. So cells must be dividing. So living cells will divide. Okay, next slide. This slide here gives you the same example. I don't really care too much for this one. This one I do care for. You should have some idea. Again, none of these things have to be memorized when it comes to this particular picture. You just have an idea of the dimensions. So have some idea of dimensions, such as atoms are very, very small. You cannot see them with your eyes. Bacteria, some of the bacteria you can. Then we have bigger, like plants and animal cells that you can easily see. And then we have frog eggs, chicken eggs, and so on, which are very easily visible with our bare eye. So have some idea of the sizing, but you do not have to memorize this chart. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is where it's very important to know the three major groups that we call domains. So three major groups that we call domains. Now, the first one we see here is bacteria and archaebacteria. That's the full name of this one. Bacteria and archaebacteria. Those are called prokaryotes. So bacteria and archaebacteria are prokaryotes. They're the single cell thing that we saw a moment ago. So bacteria, archaebacteria are prokaryotes. Then we have a third category here called eukaryotes. And eukaryotes are the protists, the plants, the fungi, and the animals. This slide is always being asked on a test. So bacteria and archaebacteria are prokaryotes. Eukaryotes are the protists, the plants, the fungi, and the animals, such as us. Okay. So this will always be asked on a test. Now the next slide is important because it has characteristics. I'm going to go over the key ones. So for example, prokaryotes are simply smaller. So prokaryotes are simply smaller. They are the bacteria and the archaebacteria. They have a plasma membrane, but they do not have organ bound. So the organelles are not membrane bound. Okay, so prokaryotes do not have a membrane bound organelle. They do have cell wall. So most of the bacteria have cell walls. Then down here at the bottom, we see that they have something called a single circular chromosome. So they have a single circular chromosome. So these are the characteristics of prokaryotes. Very important to put on a flashcard. That's one of the reasons why these lecture series are including tips to study. That's how the A students in the past got good at this, because they watched the lecture videos or they attended class when there was a in-person class and they took the tips to heart. So bacteria are simpler. They have cell walls. They have a cell membrane. They have no membrane-bound organelles, and they have a simple circular chromosome. Now let's move over to eukaryotes like us. We are very complex, such as protists, plants, fungi, and animals. Plants have a cell wall, so plants have a cell wall. Animal cells do not. So plant cells have a cell wall. Animal cells do not. Then we do have a cell membrane. We do have membrane-bound organelles. That's important. So eukaryotes, like us, eukaryotes have a membrane-bound organelle. We usually have one or more chromosomes. So like in our case, humans, we have 46 chromosomes. Okay. So we have 46 chromosomes. So this is, again, a key to put on a flashcard. So eukaryotes, again, are large. They do have cell walls if they are plants. If they are animals, they just have an outer cell membrane. Then we do have membrane-bound organelles, and we do have multiple chromosomes. So definitely put them on a flashcard. Now the things I'm giving to you in the lecture series also show up on the publishers' quizzes and homeworks. So my A students of the past, they did the publisher homework and the quizzes. Those who didn't do well. And that's one of the key reasons I've been urging the students to get started on the publisher material. Okay, here's an example of what a prokaryote looks like. So in a prokaryote, you do see a cell membrane, you do see a cell wall, right? So prokaryotes do have a cell wall, and they have a single circular chromosome. Okay, so a singular circular chromosome. Okay, that's something to put on a flashcard for prokaryotes. Then comes animal cell, plant cell. And here, notice in the author's picture, there are 3 that are found in plants, but not animals. That tends to be a good questioning for exams, for my exam and the department exam. So these 3 things, the central vacuole, the cell wall, and the chloroplast, are found only in plants, not in animals. Now earlier I mentioned flashcards. You'll see that in just the next slide. What you're going to do is you're going to take the next slide, which is the animal cell, and the different parts and put them on a flashcard. The front side of the flashcard would be the name of the part, and the back side of the flashcard will be what that particular part does. Much easier to improve yourself. Now, if you look at the bottom of this slide, the author has done something similar at the bottom of this slide here. That's like a study tool or a thing that instructors should be mentioning to the students, and that's what this is at the bottom. It's like an instructor's guideline. Now, the next slide shows you the animal cell, and this is what you're going to put on a flashcard. So you're going to take ribosome on one side of the flashcard, and then you're going to put what the ribosome is or what it does on the back side of the flashcard. And that's going to help you understand what the animal cell does. And a big chunk of this chapter is dedicated to these parts and what they do. Okay, the next slide. The next slide is the plant cell. And again, these are the three that are not found in animals, only in plants exclusively. And again, plants have also things that animal cells also have. So again, you're going to make flashcards for this with the name of the part and what it does on the back. Now, the next thing that we're going to write down is true for pretty much all living cells, and we're going to talk about the cell membrane. So we're talking about the cell membrane. Now, if you remember one of the things I mentioned in the previous chapter, we have lipids. And one of the key function of lipids that I mentioned in chapter 3, the key function I mentioned was that lipids play a role in structure. And that's exactly what this slide is about. So lipids do play a role in structure. And the key one here is phospholipid. So cell membrane is made out of a phospholipid bilayer. So a phospholipid bilayer. Okay, and that's what we're going to see in a moment with a picture. So a phospholipid bilayer. And this structure, this cell membrane, is such that the outside of that cell, of that phospholipid, is the outside of the cell, which is called extracellular fluid, because it's outside of the cell. Then on the inside of the cell, we have intracellular fluid. So outside is extracellular fluid, inside is intracellular fluid. And because of this phospholipid bilayer, things can't readily come in. Only certain kinds of things can come in, and only certain kind of things can leave. So there's actually like a wall that allows only certain things to get through. So we're going to see that. So the cell membrane, this phospholipid bilayer, is designed to be selective in terms of what it allows to come in. Now here's a picture of one. So here's a picture of a cell membrane, same thing as plasma membrane. And as you can see, we have the outside of the cell, which contains extracellular fluid. And then we have the inside of the cell. And yes, the inside of the cell is called cytoplasm. That's the name of the space. So the name of the space is called cytoplasm. And yes, some people also call it intracellular fluid. Now, the name of that fluid is sometimes called cytosol. So the name of that fluid is sometimes called cytosol. So if someone asks you on a test, what's cytosol? Cytosol is the liquid that's found in the cytoplasm. And that's the same thing as intracellular fluid. Now, in this picture, you see the outside extracellular fluid and the inside, the intracellular fluid cytoplasm. And in between, you see this phospholipid. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that there is a word called amphipathic, where you have a structure that has two ends. And in this picture, you see a ball at the top, and then we see these yellow strands. And those are those fatty acid tails that we saw in the other chapter. Okay, so the balls up here, the gray balls, they are hydrophilic because they are facing the water. They're facing the outside. And then the hydrophilic tail is in the middle here. And then we again see the balls that are facing the inside because that part is also what? Hydrophilic over here. So the side facing the extracellular fluid is hydrophilic, and the side facing the inside is also hydrophilic. And only the fatty acid tails, these yellow fatty acid tails, are hydrophobic, which are oily. And because of this, only certain types of things can go through, and that is oily things. So if you have a lipid hormone would easily go through, but a water-based hormone would not. So certain things go through, certain things don't. That makes it very selective. Now, in order to allow certain things to go through, you have these proteins here called embedded proteins. And these embedded proteins are what allow certain things to go through. Now, these embedded proteins can act as channels. So these embedded proteins will actually open up and allow things to go through like a channel, like a tube, like the Panama Canal that allows ships to go from one side of the ocean to the other ocean, like the Panama Canal. Well, the same way here, it allows things to go through the channel. These proteins can also play another role, which is cell ID. So these little bumps here are unique to that particular person. So when you get an organ transplant from somebody else, they have to match these markers. That's what they sometimes call this. These proteins, these embedded proteins or cell proteins, they're sometimes called ID markers. And everybody has a unique ID marker. So when you get someone else's organ for organ transplantation, they have to match the cell ID. So you and a sibling would not have the exact match. Only you and an identical twin would probably very come close to having an identical match. Okay? So cell ID is one function of these embedded proteins, and a channel is another. The last example that I want to give as a function for these embedded proteins is receptor. That's how drugs know where to go. Drugs know where to go, and hormones know where to go because these embedded proteins can act as receptors. So the hormone or the drug knows exactly where to go and do their thing. So in our body, we have insulin as a hormone. Well, cells of our body also have insulin receptors. And so the insulin knows where to go because the insulin receptors are found on cells. The brain is very much so for insulin receptors because glucose has to go to the brain. And yes, you have insulin receptors on cells. Okay, next slide. So over here, I don't care too much for this one because this one just says plants have cell walls, and I've already mentioned that in the previous. So I don't really care too much for this slide. Okay, this slide, don't care. Back up a little, went too fast. Okay, so didn't care for that one, didn't care for that one. Okay, now this one right here, I don't care for either, but I did tell you this already. Antibiotics are designed to do what? They're designed to break down the cell wall, break down the structure, prevent the bacteria from growing or eating or whatever, and therefore that's how they kill them. Okay, next slide. I don't care for this one. Okay, this one I do care. Now, this is letting you know that the nucleus. Now, what the author is starting to do with this slide is go into the parts of the cell, and then you have the functions that you're writing on the back side of the flashcard. So that's what you're doing there. So here we have nucleus and ribosomes, and we can see that our genes are found on what? On the DNA, and that was mentioned in the previous chapter, that we find genes on our DNA. And if you recall, a gene, and again, I'll repeat that key important sentence or definition over and over, gene is a sequence of DNA that codes for a specific protein. I mentioned it in the previous chapter. I'm repeating it again because we'll see it so many times. So genes are a sequence of DNA that codes for a specific protein. And again, proteins are the ones that do most of the work. Because remember, proteins go with a verb. They go with action. That's why proteins have multifunctional roles. That was mentioned in the previous chapter. As you can see, I'm building on chapter to chapter. Okay, next slide. So here we have chromatin. And chromatin is basically DNA that has been unwound. So they're like loose spaghetti. Okay? So normally DNA doesn't look like our nice little double helix that we see. It's loose. Okay? It doesn't look like the X and the Y chromosomes that you normally see when we have pictures of chromosomes. They don't always look like the X and the Y typically. So they're really called chromatin initially. So initially they're chromatin, but yes, they are still loose DNA. Okay? And then they thicken and thicken and thicken, and they roll up like rubber band balls, and they go from chromatin to chromosome. And that happens during cell division. So let me repeat that again. When the cell is not dividing, the DNA is called chromatin. So when the cell is not dividing, we call it chromatin. And you can barely see it on the microscope. Then, during cell division, it turns into chromosome. And that's the X and the Y chromosomes that we see, where we have 46 pairs in a typical cell. So a typical cell would have 46 chromosomes. Okay? And that's the only time you see the chromosomes are when the cell is ready to divide. Okay. All right, next slide. Here's a picture of a nucleus. If I go to the next slide, you'll see the words I shared with you. Here's our DNA molecule. This at the top up here is really chromatin, as you can now see here, chromatin. This is what you're going to see loosely. And remember, you really can't see it underneath a microscope because it's so loose like spaghetti, barely visible. And then when the cell is ready to divide, like during mitosis or meiosis that you may have heard of, well, when it starts to divide, that's when chromatin becomes chromosome, where it starts looking like the X and the Y chromosomes that you may have seen. Okay, now here's what I want you to do. Using the textbook, and you can use the PowerPoint slides as well, as you can see from my next slide, what the author is doing is going through each of the parts of the cell and giving you a synopsis. That's where you're going to take the term, like ribosome, on the front side of your flashcard, and you're going to put the information of what a ribosome does and what it is on the back side. And that's what the few remaining slides that I'm going to pass through are actually doing. So for each of these slides that you have available to you on the PowerPoint section, so if you go under modules of Eagle Online, you'll find the PowerPoints, the exact same PowerPoints I have in front of me now. And you're going to take these PowerPoints and put them onto flashcards. Okay, so moving forward, and you'll see that that's what the author is doing for each of the parts. So each of the parts are there for you to look at. And that's what you're going to put on your flashcards. Okay, so I'm just skipping through to show you that. And then these are now for the plants. Remember, chloroplasts are found in the plants. So when you make the flashcards that go with the plant cell, this is where you're going to add this one. So this one is unique only to the plant cell. Okay, so as you go through this, you'll see which ones are for plants and which ones are for animals, because you saw a picture with me earlier. And then the author resumes because mitochondria is found both in animals and plants. Now, if you recall, I said something in another chapter that is worthy of saying here as well. Remember, the entire body, the human body, uses glucose for energy, but the cell uses ATP. It was mentioned in the previous chapter. It's mentioned here as well. So glucose is the main thing that the body uses, but the cells convert it to ATP. And that's done by the mitochondria. Okay, next slide. Still continuing with the parts. Okay. All right, now I'm on this slide. Again, this is still one of the parts, but I want to highlight it. The part was called cytoskeleton. And notice we have a part of that, a subpart called microtubules. You can't see these, but every time in high school settings they say draw a cell, people usually draw a blob and have no shape or form. Well, that's not true. All cells have some shape or form, but they have like structure, like scaffolding. And just like a building has a scaffolding, a house has a wooden frame. In the same way, cells have a wooden frame called microtubules. So when I go to the next slide, you'll see these little fine lines there, these white fine lines. Well, those fine lines are microtubules. It's labeled for you in the picture. It's giving the cell some shape, some structure. So cells are not just blobs. They actually have scaffolding. They also have, like in this case, movement. So flagella, which will be my next slide, cilia and flagella also are part of this because they also have structure and shape and form. So they're still part of this story. So when I go to the next slide, you'll see flagella and cilia as a title, and that is actually what moves. So when cells move around, they use either cilia or flagella, and that's how they move around. So cilia and flagella. And yes, they do have what still? Microtubules. So microtubules are for structure, but they're also for allowing it to move. In your throat, in your trachea, in your throat, you actually have cilia that are designed to move debris and junk that goes down in your throat to bring it up so that you can either cough it up or you can sneeze it out. So we have cilia there. We have cilia in our intestinal tract as well to help move things along. So cilia and flagella. Okay. Here's another picture. And this is the one that I mentioned in the respiratory tract. So we do have cilia in the respiratory tract to move dirt and debris up. So you can sneeze it out or cough it up. Okay. All right, next slide. Okay. Don't care for this slide. Okay. I don't care for this slide. Here's cholera. It's a type of bacteria. It causes a lot of diarrhea kind of problem. Very, very deadly. You can lose body weight and fluid weight quickly. Well, its purpose is just that. Its purpose is to make you lose a lot of water. And so you can see here, there's an example of how things change. Okay. And again, notice the last slide ends with evolution because most of the chapters end with that. So we talk about bacteria resisting. Well, here it is. Here's increased resistance to cholera. Okay. So yes, notice it says that these people have an increased resistance to cholera. So these people are not likely to come down with cholera. Here's another odd one. People that have sickle cell anemia. Okay, so that's typically an African American genetic issue. So if you have sickle cell anemia, you're not likely to get malaria because the way the sickle cell anemia thing works and the protection you get from that, that actually protects you against malaria. So that was interesting when I first learned that. Okay. So yes, you can get an advantage from people like that. So they can actually find genes in people that are resistant to getting cholera and then make drugs to help other people that don't have that advantage. Okay. So that's how you can make drugs to help fight off diseases from other people who are better off. For example, during COVID, they actually make drugs and antibodies and things like that from people who survived from COVID. Okay. All right, so that is the end of chapter 4. Make sure you make the needed flashcards for the animal cell and the plant cell. That's the best way to summarize this chapter. Again, use the PowerPoints that I've provided to you under modules, and you can also refresh on this video if you need to as well. So this is the end of chapter 4. You're ready for chapter 5.